All right, and welcome back, party persons, peoples, and meeples. I am Bruce with Bazada Games, and welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to be talking about something really cool and important to me in particular. We have recently started working on a concept for a new tabletop game that I've taken the lead on, and I really think that this game breaks the mold and blurs the lines between tabletop gaming and trading card games. Since we're still in the early stages, I can't go into too much detail, but I wanted to hop on here and share the concept of the game with you guys and see what people think. So let's dive into it. First of all, let's talk about the theme of this game, and something that's always been near and dear to my heart, as well as a huge part of the fantasy and gaming community: dragons. Dragons have always been at the crux of the fantasy genre, and no matter where you look, there's different variations and iterations of dragons all over the place, with amazing lore, history, art, and all of the in-between. One of the major themes of this game is going to be centralized around dragons, and in order to play this game, gamers will assume the role of a hero and a dragon trainer in order to do battle and determine who will be crowned a dragon god. This game takes place in a world where different nations compete in a series of war games in order to crown a dragon god. Now, one of the main focuses of the game, or I guess I shouldn't say main focuses, but main aspects of the game, is going to be, while yes, you can sit down and play in a traditional head-to-head TCG style, but what I want our game to be able to do is allow the players to incorporate a modular board game that adds another layer of complexity to the match. The modular game board, which are each modeled after a different nation's battlefield, has the potential to act like an NPC, a game master, or as an adversary to both or multiple players. It even sort of acts like a dungeon in a video game as well. Equipped with its own deck and triggered by certain functions and mechanics in the game, which allows for a certain element of unpredictability in what is often a highly strategic battle between card game players. My dog's on my lap. Now I know what you're thinking. Having that level of unpredictability is kind of counterintuitive to the idea of developing a strategic deck, which is why the concept of playing with the modular game board will be entirely optional. The game will function just as effectively without the modular game board as a traditional TCG does. And then a small note, due to the general structure of the game and the way that it's played, for conversation's sake, I am going to be calling this a card game rather than a board game, just to clarify. So let's talk a little bit about the lore. Lore has always been something that is super important to me. It's honestly my favorite part of it. Any story, video game, board game, card game, you name it. The background and world building has always been something I've loved, so I wanted to make sure that there's no shortage of that in this game. I've always loved the idea of being able to not even necessarily play the game, but the game having enough lore and story on its own, and that lore and story being of good enough quality on its own, that if you wanted to, you could just be a fan of the lore, and like I said, not even possibly play the card game. So again, because this is a teaser video, I'm not going to go too much into details, and I also haven't written all the lore yet, so we're just going to touch base on the general concept of the world, what kind of world it's set in, and the overall themes of the game. This game is set in a fantasy type world where peace amongst major nations was achieved a long time ago. So all these nations live together in harmony. You know what that's from. But all these nations live together, and there's basically no war in this world. But the scholars and the intellectuals of this world knew that there would be a need for the citizens of the world to show, test, and prove their strength. The scholars had recognized that violence is a part of all of us, and the only way to keep the world peaceful was to give that part of the people a platform. And in this world, that is how the Dragon God competition was born. This worldwide war game, heroes, warriors, and mages alike battle alongside their dragon companions and armies to determine who is the strongest. Dragon trainers utilize the aid of dragons and worldly cryptids to either best their opponent or eliminate all of the dragons in their arsenal. So what kind of heroes and dragons, you ask? Well, let me answer that. Right now, as I'm developing the game, I'm looking at starting with 4 different nations, 4 different heroes, and 4 different dragons. Each dragon has a specific magic class, but all dragons have all magic classes available to them. That'll make sense later on. Heroes and dragons are not limited to one particular type of magic in this game, although they may have affinities and weaknesses with certain kinds, but the connection more so lies in each hero and each nation is aligned with a specific type of dragon. So to start off, we have our 4 heroes. We're gonna have a human hero, an elven hero, a giant hero, and a druid hero. It's important to know that in this game, those are 4 different races. I'll explain in another video later on, but as I go more into the lore, but just for now, know that the druid is not the same as the human. We're also going to be starting off with 4 different types of dragons. Your traditional true dragon, ancestral dragons, amphitheres, and fey dragons. Now don't worry, I've got lots of other heroes and dragons in the works, but for now the game is going to be developed around these 4. One of the other really cool elements that I want to incorporate into this game is the idea of cryptids. Like dragons, cryptids are not aligned with any certain type of hero or any nation. Cryptid cards will be available to almost any hero or deck unless otherwise stated on the card. But you can think of cryptids almost like mercenaries in this world. Allegiances can change, some have natural enemies, some have natural allies, but the use of cryptids in your deck and on the battlefield can really start to determine the nuance of how your deck is played. These cryptids really aren't limited to like the traditional lore list of cryptids out there. We may use some of those, we may not. We may come up with our own types of creatures and monsters that exist in this world, but nonetheless, I think it's a really fun concept. I didn't want to just limit this game to being based just around dragons. Although dragons will be the main and often strongest part of your arsenal, I wanted there to be other types of creatures and foes involved in the game as well. So let's talk about what really sets this game apart from your everyday trading card game. The whole basis of this game is the fusion, the hybridization of a trading card and a board game. So deck building and collecting your cards, trading your cards, and acquiring your cards is going to function the same way as any trading card game would. The difference is you'll also have an option to get your hands on a modular game board, which in a traditional trading card game, most players are using mats. Even if you're not using mats, you have your area on the table. The game board will go in between those 2 people and extend the table play, extend the area in which you're playing, and allow for things to happen on that board while you're playing the game. Modular game board and the world deck. In the world of this game, each nation has a section of their land utilized strictly for the war games. It's an expansive territory with terrain advantages and disadvantages, resources up for grabs, event occurrences, and even wild cryptids. These wild cryptids have no allegiance to any player in the game. The events can range from like a weather event to a historical event that's happening, and they're all going to affect the players in the game if you choose to play with the modular game board. The modular game board will be modeled after each nation's war game territory, and each modular game board will come with its own pre-constructed deck. I think that that's important to note, is that players are building their personal decks, but the world decks, the modular game board decks, those come pre-constructed. Same as you would when you buy a board game, when you get your hands on a board game. The drawing of this deck is triggered by certain optional or non-optional mechanics in the game. For example, some cards may say if this attack hits, you may draw a card from the world deck, or some cards may say something like if this attack does not hit, you must draw a card from the world deck. Granted, this is only when applicable if you've chosen to utilize the world deck. The game is going to be set up in such a way that if the world deck isn't being played with, it won't affect the function of the game or the cards. With the idea of the world deck and the modular board game, we can really explore the concept of treating a trading card game almost like a video game instance. Like the battles that are isolated in a video game, or even somewhat like being in a dungeon in a video game. The idea that in the middle of your match, the potential to flip over an event card or a wild cryptid, or something that I'm calling a catastrophe card that disrupts and redirects the focus of the game for one or more hands, to me is a really fun, cool concept. Just imagine you're in a match, against someone and all of a sudden a wild cryptid card gets flipped. And for the next turn, or even multiple turns, depending on the strength of that cryptid, you and the person you were just fighting now have to work together to take out this cryptid, or it's going to end the game for both of you. There may also be ways to utilize the cryptid and take advantage of the cryptid, and you may be spending the next hand or two fighting for priority over that cryptid. Or strategy-wise, if that cryptid pops on the field and it has a chance of killing your opponent for you, you may be able to do other things during the game that allow the game function to go differently. In the same instance, the idea applies to, you could be playing a bad matchup. Because of the unpredictability level of the modular board and the world deck, even in a bad matchup, if the right event card or catastrophe card is drawn, you could still take over the momentum of the game and change what is the perceived outcome of that game. I've seen a lot of trading card games that a bad matchup happens, and right from the start, almost 90% of the time, the person on the losing end of that bad matchup does lose. I think it'd be cool to at least have an option to upset that dynamic a little bit. I've always loved trading card games, but there really is a certain level of breaking in that can be really difficult if you didn't get into that part of the gaming community when the game was started. It can be really, really difficult to catch up to the skill level of people who have been playing the game for a long time, and I'd like to be able to break that mold without forcing people to break that mold, which is why the modular board game is only an option. I'd really like the concept or the idea of being able to sit down as a new player with somebody who's been playing this game for a long, long time, and have the playing field be a little bit more even if you choose to use the modular board. Because the modular board isn't something you can necessarily strategize for or against, as a new player, I might actually have a chance of squeaking in a win against somebody who knows how to play. And at the same time during that game, I can learn from my opponent as well, rather than always being stuck playing against people who are beginners and at the same skill level as me, which slows the learning curve of a trading card game. I can now sit down with somebody who's willing to sit down with me that's at a much higher level, and we can play this game on a much more even grounds. In a nutshell, that's why this idea is so important to me. I think this idea is also something that's conceptually accessible for a lot of people in both the trading card game and the tabletop gaming community. So yeah, that's our pitch, guys. Again, this is just a rough outline of our idea. We still have a lot more work to do and a lot more developing that needs to happen, and I will be showing it to you guys as it happens. But we wanted to put the concept in front of you and hopefully get some feedback and get your thoughts on a hybrid trading card tabletop game. We have our fingers crossed that we will be able to develop some prototypes for some upcoming events early next year, like Captain Con here in Rhode Island and PAX East up in Boston, so that we can really sit down with other TCG and tabletop fans and get some feedback on the game. But before we get to that point, I wanted to make this video and put the idea out there. So glad you stopped by and listened. Let us know what you think, and thanks again, guys. I'm Bruce with Bazada Games, and we'll see you next time.